Welcome back to this week's Parent Parsha series, Parshat Vayakhel. Much to many people's potential chagrin, I recently have started taking some continuing education courses for people who are not up on the world of psychology, continuing education history. Psychologists, for some very strange and unbeknownst reason to myself, although very happy about it, we're never required to have continuing education like every other profession that is out there. However, in 2021, all of a sudden, mid-pandemic, there was a decision that all psychologists now have to do continuing education in order to recertify their license. As you can well imagine, there was a small panic amongst most of us who were like, what? When is my license due? And how many hours do I have to do? And where am I supposed to do this? And how am I supposed to do this? But as most of us have quickly figured this out or avoided it, because heck, we're not our own psychologists, so we avoid it as well. We have everyone's kind of been asking, what are you doing? Are you just going to do one-off courses around random things? And what I settled on doing for my continuing education as my license is due in the fall for renewal was the John Gottman, who I have spoken about many a times in the past. Him and his wife, Julie, had developed the Gottman Method, which for marriage therapy, for couples therapy and couples work. And it is the gold standard for most and almost everything we know about what makes people have successful relationships, or explaining why some people have very successful relationships while other people feel more challenged in their relationships. And I find it very interesting. I've learned about it over the years. I got bits and pieces of it. And so this was like a really exciting opportunity for me to kind of do a deep dive into this course. The good news or bad news for all of you is that I actually might now have to be using some of this material in the weeks to come because I'm slightly obsessed with it. He's amazing. His wife is amazing. They're very funny. The classes are interesting. And one of the premises that he comes off out of the gate with, after doing about 25 years of research, is that there are people who are masters of relationships and people who are disasters of relationships. And I'm kind of trying to look and see like what makes people who are masters of relationships very natural in relationships, what makes them masters, what makes them successful, and what makes people who are disasters. And so I'd like to focus on one item in this week, which is the notion of personal bids. And I want you to kind of keep that idea, put it aside, and now I'm going to bring us back to the Parsha. And we're going to come back to this idea, but I think it's going to be illuminating potentially for us to think about the idea that the Torah, no surprise, because the Torah has everything in it, and you will always find it, that was ahead of John Gottman and his wife about the notion of personal bids and our response to personal bids as being keys for successful, loving marriages and sustaining marriages. And we're going to hopefully, maybe you'll agree with me, see that in this week's Parsha. And I think that with the idea that maybe for the next couple of weeks, thinking about the ways in which we engage in our relationships with our partners and our spouses really has the potential to really not just send a role modeling for our children, but also create a very strong foundation for the homes in which our children live, and to make us have a stronger relationship with our spouses. Maybe we're automatic masters of our relationships, but maybe we all could become better because even the masters only acknowledge personal bids 80 to 85% of the time, compared to the disasters, which was 30%. And so maybe it's an opportunity for us to think about how we could get ourselves out to the 90% of responses. So this week's Parsha is usually Vayakhel Pekudei, but this year is just Vayakhel, which is a opportunity for us to do a little bit of a deeper dive into what happens in this week's Parsha, which is mostly repetition. We have a repetition of Shabbat. We have a repetition of a lot of the discussion around the details of the building of the Mishkan. And we're introduced to the fact that the women, there is this idea of Chochmat, this group of very smart, intelligent, skilled women who are the artisans, who are the builders, who are the weavers, particularly of the curtains. And there are two types of curtains that are being woven, and they each come to the table with a different type of skill. Both Rashi and Rashbam really highlight the the intensity, the specificity, the artistry that these women are coming to the table with. It's a very specific type of skill. It's a very expertise type of skill. And the detailed inside beautiful curtains full of color and imagery and detail is given a high level of skill attributed to these women. But the outside covering of the Mishkan, which is goat, which in theory is of lesser quality and is what's covering it, seems to kind of almost highlight that this somehow is a more preferred, a better cover, like relatively speaking to the inside one, is a higher level and requires extra skill. And when we kind of do a little bit of a closer look into the Parshanim and what they're trying to explain, everybody, multiple Gemara, there's a Gemara in Bava Batra, there's Gemara in Sota, there's Gemara in Shabbat that we'll look into, talking about this idea. It's not Sota, it's Yuma, talking about the fact that they would weave the hairs for the outside, the tapestry for the outside of the covering while the goat was alive, and they would weave it on the goat. And it required a very specific type of special skill. As you can well imagine, this was not a easy activity. The goat is alive and moving, and it's not like you sheared it and then we're weaving it. They wove it on the goat in its state. And the Gemara in Shabbat points out that while the outer, simpler covering you might have thought should have been easier and maybe of lesser quality or required less intelligence or less artistry, but in fact, the inside, a more detailed, more beautiful one was actually much more simple to create compared to the one on the outside that required much more brilliance or this special skill of weaving. And Rav Kook, as was pointed out to me in an article that was on the Hebrew College website by Rabbi Michael Shire, who noted that Rav Kook starts to talk about the fact that the inside covering, which was beautiful and detailed and colorful, is actually a representation of the spiritual aspect of the world that is filled with insight, thinking about the idea that the Mishkan is supposed to be a reimagination of creation. And so that the inside of the Mishkan, thinking about the idea, it's closer to the Kodesh Kadoshim, thinking about the fact that it's bright and beautiful and inspirational. And that is the kind of part of our universe and our world that is much more spiritual. And that the outside part of the covering, which is plain and more simple, but requires a higher degree of skill to manage and is considered like the higher quality one of these two curtains, is much more of a representation of our daily practical engagement with the world around us. It's the yom-yom, it's the daily moments, and trying to fuse these two things together, the practical and the spiritual, that in some capacity, attaching ourselves and finding spirituality and meaning, or at least if it's placed in front of us when it's there and apparent, is somehow very easy to connect to. It's you're sitting in there on a Yom Kippur davening, on a Rosh Hashanah davening. It's big, it's glorious, it's magnanimous, it's in front of your face. You walk in, you're wowed by these curtains and the colors and the details. You don't need to search for that inspiration. It's right there in front of you. It's amazing, it's huge, it's big. But the day-to-day, the small practical moments in our life that happen all the time, that don't feel particularly super meaningful, how do we connect to those? And the acknowledgement that this is the harder, but the much more skilled and much more important moments. So taking that idea, thinking about that, and then applying that, right, without actually thinking about the ways in which we do that in our day-to-day life from a spiritual perspective, but actually just recognizing and taking a pause and not even trying to think about the details of what that looks like for us on a spiritual day-to-day basis. I think we've addressed that in some of the other videos, but I think that this idea of just the recognition that the wow is somehow very easier to connect to, but the small things are hard to connect to. And I want to switch over to keep that idea, put it somewhere for a second and now switch over to what we get introduced to another component where the women contributed very significantly to the Mishkan, and that's the kiyor, which is in this week's Parsha. We know that the kiyor, that the wash basin, where people would come in, particularly the Kohanim, Leviim, would wash their hands, wash their feet. It was a central part of the Mishkan, of the Beit HaMikdash. It was made out of the mirrors. And Moshe, originally, we know from Midrashim and from I believe it's also in the Gemara, and I believe it's also in many of the Parshanim, talk about the fact that these mirrors came from when the women were in Mitzrayim and their husbands were out in the field, and they didn't want to be intimate with their spouses, either because they were exhausted and tired and couldn't manage it, or because they were concerned and worried, is this the type of environment that we actually want to keep perpetuating the continuity of our religion? And the women, both with the belief in their marriages and with the belief in the continuity of Am Yisrael and the hope that things would get better, would come out to where the husbands were being beaten and worked to the bone, and they would use these mirrors to try to attract their husbands. And even though Moshe originally kind of saw these mirrors and said, like, this is like, why would I use such an item, which is a manifestation of like a person's most base desires? Hashkadosh Baruch Hu looked at Moshe and said, you're so wrong, right? Like, this could not be more chavivin to me. This couldn't be more beloved to me. These beautiful mirrors, a manifestation of the spirit, the physical being elevated to the spiritual, the day-to-day moments of life that maybe are just our natural way of beings as human, is actually something that is so skilled, so important, so powerful. And maybe it doesn't look spiritual, it doesn't look as spiritual when you're looking at it at the surface, but it's the essence of spirituality, it's the essence of emunah and belief and continuity. And these mirrors should be used as almost like the gateway, right? You can't get to doing the avodah of Hashem without having first washed your hands and feet, without passing through this moment in recognition that it's the mundane, simple tasks of what we do in this world and how we engage and behave. And now going back for a second, taking these two ideas, the idea that the spiritual, the colorful curtain, it's amazing, it's hard, don't get me wrong, but it's not as beautiful as sitting there and actually the required craftsmanship that is weaving on the top of a goat, that is the outside of these curtains, that is the mundane, the day-to-day, the task. And then thinking about the fact that these mirrors, these women went out and they use these mirrors so that their husbands would look at them. And now taking this idea of John Gottman's and Julie Gottman's love bids, the bids that we turn towards each other. What are they? So one of the things that they discovered, because a lot of this was originally research-based, so he's researched for about 25 years, and then she came in and said, let's take all this good research and let's actually try to utilize it to help people and help couples. And think about looking at those relationships who are masters of relationships. They have very strong relationships. Like, what are they doing that's so fundamentally different than the people who are disasters of relationships? Like, what's happening? And so there was an original hypothesis and thought, like, maybe it's the types of things that they're talking about, the ways in which they're building these grand palaces of, discussing like lofty goals and, great ideals, and they're able to come together, and there's room for that. And they discovered a lot of things. And I'm just going to mention one thing on this video tonight, because it's tonight for me. I don't know when you're listening to it. But the way in which people turned to their spouse when their spouse or the person who they were in a relationship, their partner, said something, was a huge indicator for the success of that relationship. And that's called a bid. It's a personal bid. So it's not grand. And that was the thing that was actually quite fascinating. They were expecting, like, when there was a grand conversation and the person turned to acknowledge that and then dig in around it, that must be what those people are doing relative to the other people. And it actually wasn't that. It was literally when somebody says, oh, hey, and this is the example they gave, one spouse is sitting in the partner sitting in the kitchen together, and one person picks up their head and says, oh, I didn't even notice it's a really beautiful day outside today. The act of the other person picking up their head and even just saying, oh, yeah, I didn't notice that. That is a bid. People who are masters of relationships do that about 80 to 85% of the time, whatever it is. Their spouse says something that, oh yeah, I'm thinking about making chicken for dinner tonight. Oh, okay, sounds good. Cool. You respond, you turn towards them versus the person who says something, the other person doesn't respond. Oh, it's a really nice day out there. They're looking at whatever it is that they're doing. Oh my God, I didn't even notice that there's like a bluebird across. Not responding. People who were disasters of relationships, people who struggled in their marriages, they only turned to personal bids about 30 to 35% of the time. And the love and the bids were not big. They were small. They happen all the time because all the time that we're interacting with people around us, they're making bids. And whether or not we're responding to them is actually the critical key. It's not what we're responding. I mean, of course, how we respond, what we respond. Okay, different video. But some of it was literally just about, oh yeah, I get it. Yeah, that's cool. Just the acknowledgement that was actually happening. That's considered a bid. Check it off. And that is kind of what got me thinking originally about this idea of the mirrors, of the cures. What did they do? They came out into the field and they made a bid. They said, hey, have you seen? They showed them the mirror. We don't know that every single person actually looked at their other spouse in the mirror and responded to that bid. The wife came out, she made a bid. What we do know is that the people who went on to have children, who went on to sustain, who went on to have more, to be able to sustain the generations, were the people who responded to those bids. And the message is so powerful. When someone's talking to you, when the person who you are in a relationship with, when the person who loves you and wants to connect to you is talking to you, you turn to them. You look and see what they're saying. You pay attention to them, even if it's not a big thing, even if you're in the middle of doing something. Yeah, okay, I hear you. Right? It's an acknowledgement. That is what builds relationship. That's what helps us get past that point. It's the entryway to the big, to the grand, to the spiritual, to the inspiring. It's those small things that then allow us to build lives together, to have shared dreams, to help each other fulfill our goals. But you got to be able to turn. The mirrors is a significant, is a sign of success of those people that turn towards their partner's love bids. And by putting them in the Mishkan, we're acknowledging both physically, both personally, both in those small marriages that those husbands and wives had out in the field when they were being, beaten and, starved. Those ability to turn to those spouses, but also thinking about this idea in the Mishkan, in the relationship with Hashem, we have to turn, right? When Hashem is calling, are we hearing? Are we listening? When we're calling, do we feel like Hashem is turning to us? It is a relationship. More often than not, we're going to be the ones turning to Hashem. But hopefully if our eyes are open, we're also being aware of when we feel and looking for ways in which we can feel as if Hashem is also turning to us. That is part of the reciprocal relationship. We look for it, we hear it, we're optimistic about it, even if it's just, yeah, looks like it. It may not be big, it may not be grand, it may not be that moment that we're feeling on Yom Kippur. It's just a small little practical moment with small day-to-day things. And really thinking about how we can integrate this into our own lives, into our own relationships, into our own marriages, the way in which we pause and respond to the personal bit. You can't get past the entry gate. You can't wash. The kihyur is not something that only gets used once a year or twice a year. It's not the Kodesh Kadoshim where you can only go in. Only one person goes in once a year. It's the thing that gets used all the time because it's supposed to remind us that this is something that we have to be doing all the time. And the truth of the matter is when we start to do it all the time, and that's part of the helping the people who are more of the disasters turn into the masters, right? If it's not something you're naturally doing, you can start doing it. You can learn to do it. The kiyor is something we wash our hands all the time. We can learn how to do this. We don't have to become people who are not, who don't do this. And so really this to me kind of all coming together really thinks about this idea of Hashem is telling us from the get-go. You want to know how one important component of how marriages and relationships work, whether it's a marriage between a husband and a wife or partners, or it's a relationship between Hashem and his people, you have to be able to turn towards them. Stop what you're doing. Take the world in around you and look for those small moments in the everyday and respond to those love bids. I love this. I love the waving of the love bids. Okay, so this week's parsha, you could do a heart, you could do weaving because of the curtains. You could, okay, I to be fair, I was trying to kind of rack my brain and I'm thinking about like the weaving of the goats. Okay, so I saw these like kadif, or it's like a type of like this, like Middle Eastern shredded situation. It looks amazing, looks delicious. I couldn't find it in any grocery store, to be perfectly honest. So if you can find it, good luck to you and give me a shout out. But I feel like it looks like a little bit like goat hair, like that you would be weaving. These is goat ice cream on the New York Times site. I haven't looked to see if there's a way to make it not dairy. I'm imagining not, but like, who knows? So who knows what we will be able to create. Last year, I remember I tried to create a mirror cake because of the Kior and the mirrors, total flop. But I would encourage anybody to try again. And I even had a moment like, okay, it didn't work last year. Do you want to try again? And I decided, no, that was outside of my bandwidth. I am not going to try again. And I will probably just do some cool challahs because I was in my bandwidth, even though I tried to do this katif situation, couldn't find the grocery store. It's Thursday. I've moved on. So that's kind of where I'm up to on this one. But I really encourage other people who have a bigger bandwidth than me this week to give things a try. I hope everybody has a wonderful Shabbat and had a great week.